When an unexpected responsibility falls into unlikely hands, a silent secret threatens to turn an entire life upside down, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. The morning in Cambridge dawned grey, with a fine mist enveloping the Sullivan mansion, located in the exclusive New Cambridge neighbourhood. Ruby Mitchell, 42, her curly hair tied in a discreet bun, adjusted her simple uniform while opening the back gate with her own key. 7 years working in that house had granted her this small privilege. Although the internal rules were crystal clear, each employee should remain in their sector without interfering in others' functions. The smell of cleaning products mixed with the light humidity in the air made Ruby feel momentary calm. She began her routine by checking the task list left by Margaret, the grey-haired, attentive housekeeper who coordinated all the services of the mansion. "Good morning, Ruby," said Sam, the gardener, with calloused hands and a gentle smile. "Looks like it's going to rain today." "Good morning. You'd better get ahead with the flower beds then," she responded with a discreet smile before heading to the kitchen, her territory. The Sullivan mansion was imposing like its owner, Edward Sullivan, 38, a pharmaceutical business executive, widowed for 2 years. His son Michael, just 8 months old, was cared for by Claire, a nanny with impeccable recommendations hired through an agency specializing in services for the Massachusetts elite. Ruby was arranging fruit in the crystal bowl when she heard the distant cry of the baby. She looked at the clock on the wall. 8:37. Strange, she thought. Normally Claire would have already come down with Michael for breakfast. The crying continued, more insistent. "Mrs. Margaret," Ruby called upon finding the housekeeper in the hallway. "Has Claire arrived today?" "I haven't seen her yet," Margaret replied, adjusting her thin-framed glasses. "She went out yesterday to buy diapers and said she'd be back soon. I think she must have had some delay. Mr. Edward left early for an important meeting and asked not to be disturbed." The baby's cry grew more intense, echoing through the polished wooden corridors. Ruby felt a tightness in her chest. She remembered her own daughter, Julia, whom she had lost almost 15 years ago, a victim of a rare disease when she was only 2 years old. That desperate crying awakened memories that she kept tucked away in a corner of her heart. "I'll see how he is," Ruby decided, ignoring Margaret's look of disapproval. "It's not your job, Ruby. We're trying to locate Claire." Ruby hesitated for a moment, but little Michael's anguished crying made her make a decision that would change her life. "He's been crying for too long, Mrs. Margaret. I can't ignore it." She quickly climbed the marble staircase, crossing the corridor decorated with artwork until she reached the baby's room, a spacious area decorated in shades of blue and white. The soft scent of baby cologne now mixed with an unpleasant smell. Upon entering, Ruby found Michael in the crib, his little face red from crying so much, his diaper overflowing and his clothes stained. She touched his forehead and noticed he was feverish. "My God, little one, how long have you been like this?" she murmured, picking him up carefully. The baby, feeling the warmth of Ruby's arms, reduced his crying to intermittent sobs, as if recognizing in her a safe presence. Ruby checked the room and the adjacent bathroom, finding that it was closed for maintenance. A renovation initiated the day before to fix a leak. She realized she needed to act quickly. She went down the stairs with Michael in her arms, ignoring the housekeeper's surprised look. "The bathroom is being renovated. I'll give him a bath in the kitchen," she explained firmly, as the baby clung to her blouse. In the immaculate kitchen, Ruby improvised. She prepared warm water in the stainless steel sink, testing the temperature with her elbow as she used to do with her own daughter years ago. With gentle movements, she removed Michael's dirty clothes and held him firmly, washing him carefully. The baby, initially frightened, began to calm down, even managing to attempt a smile between sobs. "There, little prince. Everything will be all right," whispered Ruby, wrapping him in the soft towel she had brought from the laundry room. It was at that exact moment that Edward Sullivan entered the kitchen. Tall, with an elegant bearing, wearing an impeccably tailored suit, he stopped abruptly before the unexpected scene. His son, semi-nude, being bathed in the kitchen sink by an employee he barely knew by name. "What's going on here?" His deep voice echoed through the environment, making Ruby momentarily freeze. "Mr. Sullivan," she stammered, but maintained her composure. Michael was alone in his room, crying for hours. He has a fever and needed an urgent bath. The bathroom in his room is being renovated, so... Edward approached, observing his son, who, surprisingly, seemed calm in Ruby's arms. He noticed the diaper rash marks on the baby's delicate skin and the expression of relief on his little face. "Where is Claire?" he asked, his voice now more contained, divided between concern for his son and discomfort with the unusual situation. "We don't know, sir. She went out yesterday to buy diapers and didn't come back." Edward ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture that Ruby noticed was one of anxiety. He rarely showed vulnerability, but at that moment, faced with his son in a precarious situation, something in his usual armor seemed to crack. "Continue what you were doing," he finally said, picking up his cell phone. "I'll call his doctor." Ruby finished the improvised bath, dried Michael carefully, and dressed him in clean clothes she had fetched from his room. The baby seemed renewed, although he was still feverish. His little brown eyes, so similar to his father's, followed Ruby with a trust she hadn't experienced in years. Meanwhile, Edward spoke on the phone in a controlled tone, but Ruby could sense his tension. After hanging up, he approached, observing his son, who now rested in her arms, almost asleep. "Dr. Mitchell is coming to examine Michael," he informed her. "Ruby, isn't it? Thank you for intervening." The words came out formal, rehearsed, as if he were in a business meeting, not talking about his own son's well-being. "I only did what anyone would do, sir," replied Ruby, feeling Michael snuggle closer in her arms. "He needed help." Margaret entered the kitchen, clearly uncomfortable with the breach of protocol. "Mr. Edward, we managed to speak with the agency. They haven't heard from Claire since yesterday. We're trying her cell phone, but it goes straight to voicemail." Edward nodded, observing how his son seemed comfortable in the arms of this woman, who, until that moment, was just another invisible employee in his house. Something in the way Ruby held Michael, in the genuine care in her gestures, reminded him of his late wife, Laura, and the maternal love he feared his son would never experience again. "Margaret, please prepare the guest room next to Michael's. Ruby will stay here until we resolve this situation," he suddenly decided. "If it's not an inconvenience," he added, looking at Ruby, a request disguised as an order. Ruby nodded, surprised. "Of course not, sir. I'll stay with him as long as necessary." On that grey morning in Cambridge, inside the imposing Sullivan mansion, something began to change. While the doctor examined Michael, diagnosing a mild, easily treatable infection, Ruby remained by his side, attentive to every instruction, as if she had been part of that family for a long time. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. 3 days passed since the incident in the kitchen. Ruby completely transformed her routine to care for Michael, who was recovering quickly under her attentive care. The guest room, adjacent to the babies, became her temporary space, allowing her to attend to any nighttime crying. Claire remained missing, leaving no traces beyond some vague messages on Margaret's cell phone about personal problems. On the sunny Wednesday afternoon, while Ruby was rocking Michael in the garden under the shade of a leafy maple tree, she noticed Edward observing them from the porch. There was something different in his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and curiosity that wasn't present in the previous days. "Hi seems happier," Edward commented, approaching with hesitant steps as if afraid of interrupting a sacred moment. "Has the fever completely gone?" "Yes, sir. The medicine worked," Ruby replied, noticing how Michael smiled upon hearing his father's voice. "I think he'd like you to hold him for a while." Edward appeared momentarily uncomfortable. Ruby realized that despite his evident love for his son, there was an invisible barrier, perhaps fear, perhaps inexperience, that prevented him from fully connecting with the child. Gently, she extended Michael toward him. "You don't need to be afraid. He recognizes your scent, your voice." Reluctantly, Edward took his son, awkwardly adjusting him in his arms. Michael stared at him with curious eyes before letting out a bubbling laugh that made Ruby smile. "See, he loves being with his dad," she encouraged. The moment was interrupted by Anthony, the driver, who approached hastily. "Mr. Edward, there's a problem at the laboratories. Mr. Mark is on the phone, says it's urgent." Edward sighed, returning Michael to Ruby's arms. "I need to resolve this. Do you mind?" "Don't worry, I'll stay with him," Ruby assured him, perceiving Edward's internal struggle between his professional and family responsibilities. As Edward walked away, Ruby felt her cell phone vibrate in her apron pocket. It was a notification from a video app. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. There she was, bathing Michael in the kitchen sink, with the sensationalist title, Kitchen Angel. Housekeeper saves neglected baby in businessman's mansion. The video, clearly captured by one of the house's security cameras, showed the entire scene of the improvised bath. Ruby turned pale, imagining the consequences. She looked at the baby in her arms, who was playing obliviously with the buttons of her blouse. "Who would do this, little one?" she whispered, distressed. That same night, dinner at the Sullivan mansion was interrupted by incessant phone calls. The video had spread like wildfire, reaching millions of views in just a few hours. Journalists gathered at the property gates, eager for details about the domestic heroine and the rescued baby. Edward, visibly disturbed, called an emergency meeting in the library. Ruby sat uncomfortably in the leather armchair, while Margaret remained standing, rigid as a statue. "How did this happen?" Edward questioned, trying to maintain his composure. "Who had access to the security cameras?" "We're investigating, sir," responded Carl, the security manager of the mansion. "The recordings are accessible only to authorized personnel, but there was a system failure 2 days ago that may have created a breach." Ruby remained silent, embarrassed to be at the center of a storm she never desired. Michael slept peacefully on the baby monitor on the table, oblivious to the chaos his story was generating. "You need to make an official statement," suggested Richard, the press officer who had been urgently called. "This video is generating dangerous speculation about neglect. We need to control the narrative." Edward massaged his temples, visibly exhausted. "And what do you suggest?" "An exclusive interview. Present Ruby as an exemplary employee who acted on maternal instinct. Explain that the nanny had a personal emergency and that it was all just a misunderstanding amplified by the internet." Ruby finally found her voice. "Mr. Edward, I don't want to appear in the media. I didn't do anything special. I just took care of Michael because he needed it." Edward observed her for a long moment. "I understand your discomfort, Ruby, but your image is already on all social networks. People are asking about you, creating theories. It would be better to clarify everything at once." Before they could continue the discussion, Anthony hurriedly entered the library. "Sir, Mrs. Teresa Sullivan is here." A tense silence fell over the room. Teresa Sullivan, Edward's mother and Michael's grandmother, was known for her strong temperament and inflexible opinions. Since her daughter-in-law's death, she had tried to influence her grandson's upbringing, frequently criticizing her son's choices. Teresa entered like a storm, elegantly dressed in a navy blue silk ensemble, her grey hair impeccably arranged. "Edward, what is this scandal? I'm receiving calls from all my friends about a video of my grandson being bathed in the kitchen sink like an animal." Ruby shrank into the armchair, feeling the weight of the matriarch's accusing gaze. "Mom, this is no time for dramatics," Edward tried to appease. It was an emergency situation. Michael was alone with a fever and the bathroom was being renovated. "And where was the nanny you hired?" "The one I said didn't inspire my confidence," Teresa questioned, casting an icy look at Ruby. "And who is this woman who appears in the video?" "This is Ruby Mitchell, a house employee for 7 years. Thanks to her, Michael received the necessary care when Claire disappeared." Teresa examined Ruby from head to toe. "And now you've transformed her into the new nanny. Edward, you never learn. First you hire a stranger who abandons your son, and now you promote a housekeeper to care for my grandson." Ruby stood up, embarrassed. "Excuse me, I'll go check on Michael." "Stay," ordered Edward, surprising everyone, including himself. "Ruby has been taking exemplary care of Michael these past days. She deserves our respect, not accusations." The confrontation between mother and son was interrupted by the sound of Richard's cell phone. When he answered, his face turned pale. "Mr. Edward, Channel 8 is on air right now with an exclusive interview with Claire." Everyone turned to the library television when Richard turned it on. There was Claire, perfectly composed, strategically positioned tears, relating how she had been unjustly dismissed after a small delay caused by personal problems. "I just went out to buy diapers, but my sister had a serious problem and I needed to help her," she explained to the interviewer. "When I came back, they had already replaced me with someone else. Mr. Sullivan wouldn't even listen to my explanations." Edward turned off the television, furious. "That's a lie. She never came back. never tried to contact us. I'll call our lawyers immediately, declared Richard, moving away to make the call. That chaotic night after everyone had retired, Ruby remained awake, watching over Michael's sleep. The little one slept serenely, clutching a stuffed bunny, completely oblivious to the storm forming around him. In the master bedroom, Edward also couldn't sleep. He mentally reviewed the past few days, noticing patterns he had previously ignored. Claire frequently left to buy things for the baby, returning hours later without clear explanations. Michael cried excessively when he was with her, something Edward had attributed to teething, but now seemed suspicious. The next morning, after an almost sleepless night, Edward made a decision. He found Ruby in the kitchen preparing Michael's bottle as the baby played happily in an improvised playpen. "Ruby, I'd like to make you a formal proposition," he announced, observing how his son smiled upon seeing her. "I want you to officially take over Michael's care as his primary nanny." Ruby stopped what she was doing, surprised. "Mr. Edward, I don't have specific training for this. I'm just a housekeeper." "You have something much more valuable, my son's trust," he replied, approaching the playpen where Michael extended his little arms, asking to be picked up. "And honestly, mine too," Ruby hesitated. "What about Mrs. Teresa? She wouldn't approve." "My mother will have to accept my decisions. Michael is my son," he stated, with a conviction he rarely demonstrated in family matters. "Besides, I'm hiring a professional nanny, Patricia Anderson, to work alongside you. She has all the certifications my mother values so much, but you will be the primary reference for Michael." The proposal was tempting. Ruby felt a special connection with the little one, something she hadn't experienced since the loss of her daughter. However, something bothered her. What about the video leak? Wouldn't that harm the family's image? Edward smiled slightly. "Richard showed me the comments on social networks. People are calling you the kitchen angel, criticizing Claire and, surprisingly, praising me for recognizing your value. Apparently, my image as a cold businessman is transforming into that of a father who values his son's well-being above social conventions." Ruby couldn't help but smile. The irony of the situation didn't escape her. "In that case, I accept the challenge, Mr. Edward. For Michael." "For Michael," he agreed, extending his hand in a formal gesture that contrasted with the intimacy of the conversation. At that moment, as they sealed the agreement, neither of them noticed Margaret discreetly observing from the door, her enigmatic gaze reflecting thoughts she kept to herself. 2 weeks passed since Ruby officially took over Michael's care. The Sullivan mansion, previously an environment of formal silences and rigid hierarchies, now echoed with childish laughter and pleasant conversations. Ruby had transformed not only the baby's routine, but the entire atmosphere of the home. Patricia Anderson, the professional nanny hired to work with Ruby, was a woman in her early 30s, with straight dark hair always tied in an impeccable ponytail. With a degree in education and specialized in early childhood education, she arrived with an impressive resume and recommendations from influential Boston families. However, from the first day, it was clear that Michael didn't accept her. "He simply won't stop crying when I'm alone with him," lamented Patricia, returning a crying Michael to Ruby's arms, who immediately calmed him with a simple lullaby. "I've tried all the techniques I learned in my courses." Ruby smiled understandingly. "Don't worry, children are like that. They need time to adapt to new people." "But with you it was instantaneous," observed Patricia, unable to hide a tone of envy in her perfectly modulated voice. "It's as if you already knew each other." That observation echoed in Ruby's mind as she tidied Michael's room that afternoon. It was true that the bond between her and the baby seemed to transcend the time they spent together. There were moments when Michael looked at her with an almost adult intensity, as if wanting to communicate something beyond his limited verbal capabilities. While organizing the diapers in the cabinet, Ruby noticed something strange. An unopened package had an expiration date from 6 months ago. Checking other items, she found more expired products, carefully positioned behind the new ones as if someone wanted to hide the fact. "How strange," she murmured to herself, separating the expired items. Continuing her investigation, she opened a rarely used drawer and found a manila envelope. Inside, several receipts for purchases supposedly made for Michael, expensive products that Ruby had never seen in the house. A noise at the door made her quickly put away the envelope. Patricia was standing at the threshold, observing her with a neutral expression. "Mrs. Margaret is calling. Mr. Edward wants to speak with both of you." Ruby nodded, trying not to show her discomfort. There was something in Patricia's gaze that disturbed her, as if the professional nanny was constantly evaluating her every move. In the library, Edward seemed less tense than usual. Beside him, a middle-aged man with thick-framed glasses introduced himself as Dr. Robert Thompson, a renowned pediatrician from Boston. "Ruby, I've hired Dr. Thompson to do a special follow-up for Michael," explained Edward. He reviewed the medical records and noticed some inconsistencies in the period when Claire was caring for him. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Sullivan informed me that you were the first to notice Michael's fever 2 weeks ago. Did you notice anything else when you started caring for him? Any detail can be important." Ruby hesitated, aware of Patricia's and Margaret's presence. "Well, besides the fever and severe diaper rash, I noticed he was lighter than he should be for his age, and very sensitive to loud noises, as if he were frightened." "Interesting," murmured the doctor, making notes. "This could indicate a pattern of neglect," Edward completed, the words laden with guilt. "How did I not notice this?" "Mr. Edward," Ruby gently intervened, "you have a company to run. You trusted the professionals you hired." "This is exactly the problem," he replied, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that Ruby now recognized as a sign of anxiety. "I completely delegated my son's care. I barely knew his routine, his schedule." Dr. Thompson cleared his throat. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to examine Michael now and then talk in more detail about implementing a new care routine." "Of course," Edward agreed. "Ruby, could you bring Michael? He's more comfortable with you." As Ruby withdrew, she noticed Patricia's slightly displeased look. The tension between the two was palpable, though never verbalized. In the room, Ruby found Michael sleeping peacefully. As she carefully picked him up, she noticed something shiny stuck between the crib rail and the mattress. It was a small child's pendant in the shape of an angel, which definitely didn't belong to Michael. The object awakened a painful memory. Her daughter Julia had a similar pendant, a gift from her grandmother at her christening. Ruby felt her heart tighten. She put the object in her pocket to examine it better later, and took Michael for the medical examination. After a thorough evaluation, Dr. Thompson confirmed that Michael was healthy, recovering well from what he diagnosed as a period of inadequate care. "He's responding very well to your care, Ms. Mitchell," praised the doctor. "The bond between you is evident and beneficial for his development." Patricia, who observed everything from the door, couldn't hide her disappointment. "Doctor, as a certified professional in child development, I can guarantee that I'm implementing all the recommended techniques, but the baby simply doesn't respond to me." "Emotional connection transcends techniques, Ms. Anderson," the doctor replied kindly. "Children have a keen perception of who truly cares about them." That night, after everyone had retired, Ruby stayed awake examining the pendant found in the crib. There was nothing special about it, just a small silver angel similar to many others, but its inexplicable presence disturbed her. "Who do you belong to?" she whispered, turning the object between her fingers. It was then that she noticed something engraved on the back, the initials MCS. Ruby tried to recall if Claire had any surname with these initials, but couldn't remember. The ex-nanny had always been reserved about her personal life, keeping conversations limited to work. Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise coming from Michael's room. Immediately alert, Ruby ran to check. The baby was agitated, moving in the crib and babbling incomprehensible words. "Shh, little one. Everything's all right," she whispered, stroking his hair. Michael briefly opened his eyes, fixing them on Ruby before murmuring something that strangely sounded like Emma, before going back to sleep. Ruby froze. Who was Emma? Was it some cartoon character that Claire showed him? Or was it a real name? Perhaps someone close to the ex-nanny. The next morning, while preparing Michael's breakfast in the kitchen, Ruby was surprised by Edward, who rarely appeared at that hour. "Good morning," he greeted, seeming slightly uncomfortable. "I hope I'm not disturbing." "Not at all, sir," Ruby replied, noticing that he was wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit, jeans and a polo shirt that made him look younger and more accessible. "Michael just woke up. I'm preparing his cereal." Edward approached, observing his son, who was playing happily in the high chair. "He seems especially happy today." "He slept well despite having a small nightmare," commented Ruby, deciding to mention her discovery. "Mr. Edward, yesterday I found something strange in Michael's crib, a pendant with the initials MCS. Do you know who it might belong to?" Edward frowned, taking the object that Ruby extended to him. "I don't recognize this. It definitely isn't Laura's. She didn't wear jewelry of this type. I thought it might be Claire's, but I don't remember her full surname." "Claire Bradley," replied Edward, still examining the pendant. "It doesn't match the initials. Strange. I'll ask Carl to check if it belongs to any other employee." Ruby nodded, hesitating before continuing. "There's one more thing. Last night Michael said something during his sleep. It sounded like Emma. Does that mean anything to you?" Edward seemed momentarily disturbed. "Emma. Laura had a cousin named Emma Mary Claire Spencer who visited Michael when he was a newborn, but I doubt he remembers her. He wasn't even speaking at the time." "Children absorb more than we imagine," commented Ruby, as she served the cereal to Michael, who ate with enthusiasm, especially names and faces. Edward observed his son with an expression that mixed admiration and regret. "I've been missing so many important moments, Ruby. Yesterday, Dr. Thompson made me realize how distant I am from my own son's life. It's never too late to change that, sir. Please, when it's just the three of us, you can call me Edward." Ruby smiled, surprised by the request. "As you wish." "Edward." He returned the smile, creating a moment of connection that was interrupted by the abrupt entrance of Teresa Sullivan, impeccably dressed, despite the early hour. "Edward, I didn't know you now take breakfast in the kitchen with the staff," she commented acidly, casting a critical look at Ruby. "Good morning, Mother," Edward replied, his tone returning to its usual formality. "I came to see Michael before going to the office." Teresa approached her grandson, who immediately began to cry and extend his arms toward Ruby. The matriarch's expression hardened. "I see the boy is completely attached to the nanny," she observed, pronouncing the last word as if it were an insult. "We need to talk about this in private, Edward." Before Edward could respond, Margaret appeared at the kitchen door. "Mr. Edward, Mr. Mark called. He said it's urgent, about the board meeting." Edward sighed. "I need to take that. We'll talk later, Mother." After his departure, Teresa fixed her gaze on Ruby, who continued feeding Michael with studied tranquility. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Ruby Mitchell, but I know women like you, taking advantage of a widower's vulnerability and his child." Ruby interrupted the process of feeding Michael, facing Teresa directly. "With all due respect, Mom, I'm not playing any game. I'm just taking care of a child who needs attention and affection. If you see something beyond that, the problem is in your interpretation, not in my actions." Teresa seemed momentarily disconcerted by the direct response. "Just remember your place in this house," she warned before leaving a trail of expensive perfume in the air. Margaret, who had watched the exchange of words from the door, approached hesitantly. "Ruby, be careful with Mrs. Teresa. She has a lot of influence over Mr. Edward." "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Margaret." The housekeeper nodded, but her gaze conveyed concern. "Just be careful. This house has many secrets." That enigmatic phrase echoed in Ruby's mind as she finished feeding Michael. What did Margaret mean? What secrets did the Sullivan mansion hide behind its imposing walls and perfect gardens? That afternoon, while Michael was napping, Ruby decided to investigate Claire's former room better. With the excuse of organizing the space for possible visitors, she obtained permission from Margaret to enter the environment that had remained untouched since the ex-nanny's abrupt departure. The room was impeccably tidy, as if Claire knew she wouldn't return. On the bedside table, she found a notepad with notes about Michael's routine, bottle times, baths, and naps. Absently flipping through the notepad, Ruby noticed something strange on the last page. A phone number with the name Mary Claire, urgent, written in hurried handwriting. Mary Claire. The initials on the pendant, MCS, could easily correspond to Mary Claire something with S. The discovery left Ruby uneasy, but she decided not to immediately share it with Edward. First, she needed to better understand the connection between this mysterious Mary Claire, and possibly Michael. The days in Cambridge were getting increasingly warm, announcing the approach of summer. At the Sullivan mansion, the routine had been established with Ruby as the central figure in Michael's care. while Patricia assumed an increasingly administrative role, organizing medical appointments, researching schools for the future, and maintaining detailed records of the baby's development. On a particularly stuffy afternoon, while Michael slept under the vigilance of a baby monitor, Ruby took the opportunity to organize some photographs that Edward had requested for a memory album of his son's first year. In the silent library, she was carefully separating the images when she was surprised by Sam, the gardener. "Sorry for the scare, Ruby," he smiled, placing a vase with fresh roses on the side table. "Mrs. Margaret asked to change the flowers." "It's all right," replied Ruby, noticing how Sam curiously looked at the photographs. "Want to see?" "They're photos of Michael since he was born," the gardener approached with genuine interest. "He's changed so much. Laura would be proud of her son." The mention of Edward's deceased wife aroused Ruby's curiosity. "Did you know Mrs. Laura well?" "I worked here throughout their marriage," explained Sam, pointing to a photo where Laura, a woman of delicate beauty and expressive eyes, held newborn Michael. "She loved the garden, especially the orchids. She spent hours talking with me about the plants, even when the disease had already weakened her." "What disease did she have?" Ruby asked delicately. "A heart complication that arose during pregnancy. The doctors advised terminating, but she vehemently refused. She said that baby was her miracle after so many failed attempts." Sam sighed, remembering. "She fought bravely for months after Michael's birth, but her heart couldn't resist." Ruby felt a lump in her throat. It must have been devastating for Mr. Edward. "It was more than that." Sam lowered his voice, looking around to make sure they were alone. He blamed himself. He believed he should have insisted she follow the medical recommendation. After Laura passed, he buried himself in work, could barely look at his son without seeing her. And that's when they hired Claire. Exactly. The agency recommended her as a specialist in caring for babies in situations of family mourning. At first, she seemed perfect, professional, discreet, experienced, but, Ruby encouraged, noticing the gardener's hesitation. Sam moved even closer, almost whispering now. There was something strange about her behavior. Sometimes I'd see her observing the grounds as if waiting for something, and she received frequent visits when Mr. Edward was traveling. What kind of visits? A young woman, beautiful, always elegantly dressed. She arrived in taxis, never the same one, and stayed for hours. Ruby felt a chill. "Do you know her name?" "I was never introduced, but once I heard Claire call her Emma." The baby monitor emitted the sound of Michael waking up, interrupting the conversation. Ruby thanked Sam for the information and quickly went up to attend to the little one. Upon entering the room, she found Patricia already there, trying to calm Michael, who was crying desperately. "Finally," sighed the professional nanny, handing the baby to Ruby. "He woke up screaming and I can't calm him down at all." Ruby welcomed Michael, who immediately snuggled against her chest, reducing his crying to small sobs. "He must have had a nightmare. Does it happen often?" "Sometimes," replied Patricia, nervously adjusting her ponytail, "but never so intense. He was screaming something that sounded like Mama or Emma. I couldn't quite understand." That information triggered an alert in Ruby. Emma. Could it be possible that Michael was trying to say a name? Emma. Mary Claire. "Patricia, have you ever heard of someone named Mary Claire related to Michael or Claire?" The professional nanny frowned. "Not that I remember." "Why?" Ruby decided to share part of her discoveries. "I found a pendant with the initials MCS in his crib, and then a phone number in Claire's notepad with the name Mary Claire." "Strange," commented Patricia, but her tone didn't show much interest. "Must be some friend of Claire's. Did you ask Mr. Edward?" "Not yet." "Well, if you think it's important, you should mention it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to organize the weekly reports for the pediatrician." After Patricia's departure, Ruby gently cradled Michael, noticing how he firmly grabbed her blouse, as if fearing she might disappear. "What's going on in this house, little one?" she whispered, kissing his forehead still warm from sleep. That night, during dinner, Edward surprised everyone by announcing a weekend trip to the family beach house in Bayport. "I think we all need a change of scenery," he explained, while savoring the dinner prepared by the family chef. "Michael has never seen the ocean, and it would be a good opportunity for him to experience it." Teresa, who dined with them as she did every Friday, didn't hide her disapproval. Edward, an 8-month-old child, has no awareness of seeing the ocean. This is just an excuse to escape your responsibilities here. I'm not escaping anything, Mother, Edward replied with surprising firmness. On the contrary, I'm assuming my responsibility as a father. Dr. Thompson recommended different activities to stimulate Michael's development. Ruby, who was feeding the baby at a separate table, as Teresa insisted, couldn't help but notice the change in Edward's posture. There was a determination in his voice that wasn't present weeks ago. "And who will accompany you on this improvised trip?" questioned Teresa, delicately cutting a piece of salmon. "Ruby and Patricia, obviously, to take care of Michael. Anthony as the driver, and I've invited Mrs. Margaret, who deserves a break from the routine." "And I wasn't invited." Teresa's indignation was palpable. Edward smiled slightly. "Of course you're invited, Mother, but I imagined you wouldn't be interested, considering your comment about children and beaches." Teresa narrowed her eyes, perceiving her son's maneuver. "I will certainly go. Someone needs to ensure everything is conducted properly." After dinner, while everyone was withdrawing, Edward asked Ruby to remain. When they were alone in the dining room, he seemed nervous, repeatedly rubbing the ring he wore on his little finger, a habit that Ruby had already identified as a sign of anxiety. "Ruby, I need to tell you something important about this trip," he began, sitting closer. "It's not just a casual outing." "I imagined," she replied, intrigued. "I received some disturbing information about Claire and her past. It seems she used false documents to get the job here. The agency is horrified and cooperating with a discreet investigation." Ruby felt her heart race. False documents? But how did she pass the background check? "Apparently, it was very well planned. One of the private investigators I hired discovered that her real name may not be Claire Bradley, and that she may have worked for other families under different identities." "That's disturbing." Ruby chose her words carefully. "Do you think there's any danger to Michael?" Edward ran his hand through his hair. "I don't know. That's why the trip. I want Michael away from here while we deepen the investigation. The beach house is isolated and has reinforced security. We'll be safe there." Ruby nodded, deciding to share her own discoveries. "Mr. Edward, I found some strange things related to Claire, a pendant with the initials MCS in Michael's crib and a phone number in the name of Mary Claire in her notepad." Edward's expression immediately changed. "Mary Claire? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. The name was written with the word urgent next to it." Edward abruptly stood up, walking back and forth. Mary Claire was Laura's cousin's maiden name, Emma Mary Claire Spencer. She and Laura were very close in childhood, but grew apart in adulthood. Emma never approved of our marriage. "The same Emma that Michael calls out during his sleep?" Edward stopped, visibly disturbed. How could he know her? Emma came only once, for Laura's funeral, and barely looked at Michael. "Maybe Claire knew her," suggested Ruby. "Sam mentioned that Claire received visits from a woman when you traveled." "This is concerning." Edward frowned deeply. "If Emma is involved, the situation may be more complex than I imagined. She always had resentments against my family, especially after I inherited Laura's share in the pharmaceutical company that belonged to their father." "Do you think it could be some kind of revenge?" Ruby asked, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. "I don't know, but I won't risk my son's safety to find out," Edward replied with determination. "We're going to Bayport early tomorrow. Please prepare only the essentials for you and Michael discreetly." "The fewer people who know the details, the better," Ruby agreed, although a sense of apprehension grew within her. What had begun as a case of neglect seemed to be transforming into something much darker. That night, after packing a small suitcase with the necessities for the trip, Ruby remained awake, thoughtful. She mentally reviewed all the events since she had taken over Michael's care. The expired products, the strange receipts, the pendant, the mentions of Emma, Claire's suspicious behavior. There was a pattern there waiting to be discovered. Suddenly, she remembered something she had ignored before. At Patricia's welcome party, Margaret had casually mentioned that Claire had been recommended by someone close to the family, not by the agency, as Edward believed. Who had recommended Claire? And why? A subtle noise interrupted her thoughts. It seemed to come from the hallway. Ruby silently got up and opened a crack in the door to check. At the end of the dark corridor, she could distinguish Patricia's silhouette entering Claire's old room, looking furtively to both sides before closing the door. Ruby felt a chill, What would the professional nanny be doing in Claire's room at that hour of the night? For a moment she considered following her, but the baby monitor on her bedside table emitted the soft sound of Michael's breathing, reminding her of her primary responsibility. Tomorrow, she promised herself, returning to bed. Tomorrow in Bayport, when Michael is safe, I'll discover what's happening in this house. Sleep was slow to come, and when she finally dozed off, Ruby dreamed of a woman with an indistinct face, holding a baby, and repeatedly whispering, "He is mine by right." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The road to Bayport wound through the coastal mountains, providing stunning views of the Atlantic forest. In the comfort of the executive van driven by Anthony, Michael slept peacefully in Ruby's lap. While Patricia leafed through documents on her tablet, Margaret knitted silently, and Teresa cast critical glances out the window, occasionally commenting on the imprudence of traveling with such a young baby. Edward, seated next to Ruby, seemed more relaxed as they moved away from Cambridge. Occasionally his eyes met Ruby's in the window's reflection, sharing a silent understanding about the true purpose of this trip. "We're almost there," announced Anthony, turning onto a private road that descended toward the sea, about 10 minutes to the house. The Sullivan property in Bayport was less imposing than the mansion in Cambridge, but equally luxurious, a modern construction of glass and sustainable wood, strategically positioned on a small private peninsula, ensuring absolute privacy. The turquoise sea was visible from almost all rooms, and an exclusive beach stretched invitingly below the large terraces. "Finally," sighed Teresa, being the first to descend when Anthony parked, "I hope at least the house is adequately prepared." "I asked the local team to have everything ready," assured Edward, helping Ruby descend with Michael, who had awakened with the end of the car's movement and was looking around with curiosity. "They also installed additional security equipment as I requested." While everyone settled into their respective rooms, Ruby took Michael to the space specially prepared for him, a spacious children's room overlooking the sea, decorated in light tones and equipped with all the necessary items for the baby's comfort. "Look, little one," murmured Ruby, taking him to the window. "It's the ocean. One day you'll play in that water, build sandcastles and collect seashells." Michael laughed, clapping his little hands as if he understood. Ruby couldn't help but smile, even with all the concerns she carried. There was something about that baby that awakened the best in her, an ability to live in the present moment, despite the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Edward, already dressed more casually in shorts and a linen shirt. "May I come in?" he asked, although he was already inside the room. "I wanted to know if everything is in order for you both." "It's perfect," assured Ruby. "Michael seems to have liked the view." Edward approached, standing beside them at the window. It was Laura's favorite place. "We bought this house when we discovered she was pregnant. She said she wanted our child to grow up knowing the sea." The mention of Laura created a moment of unexpected intimacy. Ruby realized that Edward rarely spoke of his late wife, as if the subject were too painful to be verbalized. "She would have been happy to know you fulfilled that wish," commented Ruby softly, observing how Michael stretched his arms toward his father. Edward hesitated before taking his son, as he always did. But this time Ruby took a step back, forcing him to assume responsibility. Awkwardly, he adjusted Michael in his arms, surprised when the baby grabbed his shirt and snuggled, apparently comfortable. "He recognizes you," smiled Ruby. "Children have a sixth sense for knowing who loves them, even when the person doesn't openly demonstrate it." Edward swallowed hard, visibly moved to feel his son relaxed in his arms. "I don't know if I'm a good father, Ruby. I've always feared not being up to the task after Laura. She was the one who knew how to love unconditionally." "You're learning, that's what matters." The moment was interrupted by Patricia's arrival, who stopped at the door with a slightly displeased expression upon seeing the family scene. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her professional voice masking any emotion. "I just came to inform that lunch is being served on the terrace." "Thank you, Patricia. We're coming," replied Edward, returning Michael to Ruby with visible reluctance. During lunch, served under a pergola covered with purple bougainvillea, the conversation flowed surprisingly lightly. Even Teresa seemed milder, perhaps influenced by the beauty of the location. Only Patricia maintained a polite reserve, observing interactions and making discreet notes on her tablet. "This afternoon I thought about taking Michael to feel the sand for the first time," suggested Edward, surprising everyone with his unusual paternal involvement. "Ruby, would you accompany us?" "Of course," she replied, noticing the disapproving look Teresa gave Edward. "I should go too," Patricia quickly intervened. "As responsible for Michael's motor development, I'd like to document his first experience with natural textures." "That won't be necessary," Edward replied with surprising firmness. "We want a quiet moment, without pressures or documentation. It will be just a father, his son, and—" He hesitated, searching for the appropriate word. The person his son trusts most. The silence that followed was laden with unverbalized tensions. Teresa took a long sip of her iced tea, while Patricia maintained a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. After lunch, as promised, Edward, Ruby, and Michael went down to the private beach. The sky was an intense blue, dotted with some white clouds that seemed hand-painted. The calm sea created an almost unreal landscape in its perfection. Edward had personally taken charge of bringing all the necessary items: hat for Michael, sunscreen, water, towels, and even some beach toys. It was the first time Ruby had seen him fully assuming the paternal role, without delegating responsibilities. "Shall we feel the water first?" suggested Ruby, helping to apply sunscreen to Michael's chubby little legs. "Just wet his feet, for him to get used to it." Edward agreed, taking the initiative to carry his son to the water's edge. Together they introduced Michael to the oceanic world, first his feet, then his little hands touching the foam of the small waves. The baby's crystalline laughter echoed across the deserted beach, creating a moment of pure joy that contrasted with the mysteries and tensions of the past days. "He's not afraid," observed Edward, genuinely marveled. "Look how he tries to catch the water." "Children are naturally curious," replied Ruby, mentally recording that precious moment, not only for Michael's development, but for the visible transformation in Edward, whose serious expression had given way to a relaxed smile. After playing in the water, they sat under a beach umbrella for Michael to rest. The baby, exhausted and satisfied, quickly fell asleep in Ruby's lap, while Edward contemplated the horizon. "Thank you," he said suddenly, without diverting his gaze from the sea. "For what?" "For showing me that I can be a real father, that I don't need to outsource my role in my son's life." Ruby smiled. "You always had that capacity. You just needed to believe in it." "Edward," he corrected softly. "Please." "Edward," she repeated, feeling a strange intimacy in pronouncing his name. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but full of unspoken meanings. It was Edward who finally broke it. "I need to tell you something important, Ruby. Something I discovered last night that might explain a lot." Ruby adjusted Michael more comfortably in her arms, preparing for what would come next. "The investigator I hired managed to access some communications between Claire and Emma," continued Edward, his voice now deeper. "It seems they met in college years ago and kept in touch. When Laura became pregnant, Emma saw an opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" asked Ruby, although she already suspected the answer. "Revenge, perhaps, or financial gain. It's still not clear. What we know is that Emma provided false references, so Claire would be hired as Michael's nanny. The agency never recommended her. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation by Emma, who used her family connection to induce my mother to hire Claire. Mrs. Teresa was involved." Ruby couldn't hide her surprise. Not consciously, Emma approached her at a charity event, pretending to want a family reconciliation after Laura's passing. She casually mentioned that she knew an excellent nanny, specialized in caring for babies who had lost their mothers. My mother, always concerned with appearances and credentials, insisted that I hire her. Ruby processed the information, mentally connecting dots. "And what was their plan?" Edward hesitated, looking at sleeping Michael before continuing. "I believe the initial objective was to monitor Michael, perhaps find some evidence of neglect that could be used against me. Emma always believed that I married Laura out of interest in the Spencer family fortune. But that's not true," stated Ruby, not as a question, but as a realization. "No," Edward smiled sadly. "I loved Laura more than anything. Our marriage went against my own family, who considered the Spencers new money without tradition. The irony is that I ended up inheriting part of her family's business because Laura wanted it that way, to ensure Michael's future. And Emma didn't accept that. Exactly. After the reading of the will, she completely disappeared. I thought it was just grief and resentment. I never imagined she was planning something so elaborate. Ruby looked at Michael, so peaceful in his innocent sleep. But what did they intend to do with him? It doesn't make sense to just monitor him for months. Edward ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that Ruby already recognized as a sign of disquiet. The investigator found concerning records. Emma initiated a process to contest Michael's custody, claiming that I would be an absent and negligent father. The evidence would be provided by Claire, who systematically documented moments when I was absent or completely delegated Michael's care. That's why the false receipts and expired products, Ruby suddenly understood. She was creating a scenario of neglect. Exactly. But you appeared and ruined their plan. Edward smiled for the first time since he began the revelation. Your spontaneous act of caring for Michael, recorded in that leaked video, created a completely different public narrative. Instead of a negligent father, I became the businessman who valued his son's well-being above social conventions, allowing a dedicated employee to assume maternal care. Ruby felt a wave of understanding. That's why Claire disappeared so suddenly. She realized the plan was compromised. And that's why Emma is furious, completed Edward, his tone becoming more serious. The investigator intercepted recent messages between them. Emma is convinced that Michael should be raised by her as a representative of the Spencer family. She sees this as her legal and moral right. Does she represent any real danger? Asked Ruby, instinctively pressing Michael closer to her chest. I don't believe she would go to physical extremes, but she certainly represents a legal and emotional threat. That's why this trip, to give us time to gather evidence against them before Emma tries some legal maneuver. Ruby remained silent for a few moments, absorbing all the information. Finally, one piece of the puzzle still bothered her. And the pendant? The initials MCS? Edward smiled enigmatically. That's still a mystery. But I have a theory. Mary Claire Spencer was Emma's maiden name. The pendant could be a sort of marking, a symbol of ownership. As if she were marking Michael as hers. Possibly. The most disturbing thing is to think of how many times she may have been in my house, close to my son, without my knowledge. Looking at the infinite ocean before her, Ruby felt a growing determination. Michael deserved peace and security, far from family conspiracies and resentments. Edward deserved the chance to be the father he clearly wanted to be, without shadows of the past threatening his future. What do you intend to do now? She finally asked. Gather sufficient evidence for a process of identity fraud against Claire and attempted procedural fraud against Emma. My lawyers are confident we'll get a permanent restraining order. And in the meantime, Edward looked directly at Ruby for the first time in that conversation. In the meantime, I need you by my side, not just as Michael's nanny, but as, he hesitated, someone I fully trust. Those words, so simple and direct, carried an emotional weight that neither was fully prepared to face. Ruby felt her heart accelerate, but maintained her composure. I'll be here, she promised simply. Michael chose that moment to wake up, stretching and smiling upon seeing his father and Ruby together. As if understanding the importance of that moment, he extended a little hand to each of them, creating a physical connection that mirrored the emotional bond strengthening between the three. Back at the house, they found a tense atmosphere. Patricia was walking back and forth in the living room, nervously talking on the phone, while Margaret observed the sea with a worried expression. What happened? Edward immediately asked. Margaret turned, her normally serene face marked by lines of concern. Teresa received a call and left in a hurry. She said she needed to return to Cambridge immediately and asked Anthony to take her. My mother returned to Cambridge, without warning. Edward frowned, exchanging a significant look with Ruby. She seemed quite disturbed, continued the housekeeper. Something about an unmissable commitment she had forgotten. Patricia hung up the phone, approaching. Mr. Edward, I received a strange call. A woman who didn't identify herself asked if Michael was all right and when we would return to Cambridge. A heavy silence fell over the environment. Edward immediately picked up his phone. I'll reinforce security, he declared, moving away to make the call. Ruby felt a shiver run down her spine. The tranquility of that day at the beach had been just a temporary pause in the storm that was now rapidly approaching. Looking at Michael in her arms, She made a silent promise to protect him whatever the cost. What none of them noticed was Patricia discreetly photographing some documents Edward had left on the table before going to the beach, or the fact that, moments before the mysterious call, she had sent a text message with the exact location of the house. Night fell over Bayport with a tropical storm that seemed to mirror the growing tension inside the Sullivan house. Lightning occasionally illuminated the dark sky, projecting disturbing shadows through the elegantly decorated rooms. Edward had reinforced security. 2 men now patrolled the property and tried to contact his mother repeatedly, without success. "Her cell phone is off," he informed, entering the room where Ruby was rocking Michael, who was strangely agitated, resisting sleep. "And Anthony isn't answering either. Something is wrong." "Do you think your mother could be involved with Emma?" Ruby asked directly, keeping her voice low so as not to further disturb the baby. Edward sighed, sitting heavily on the sofa. "Not consciously. My mother is proud and controlling, but she loves Michael in her own way. I believe Emma is manipulating her as she has done from the beginning." A particularly strong thunder made Michael start and begin to cry. Ruby cradled him with more intensity, humming softly until he calmed down. "Where is Patricia?" asked Edward, noticing the professional nanny's absence. "She said she was going to organize Michael's room for the night," replied Ruby, with a hint of distrust she couldn't disguise. Edward caught her hesitation. "You don't trust her, do you?" "There's something in her behavior that bothers me," admitted Ruby. "The way she observes everything, how she always seems to be evaluating situations instead of participating in them. And that mysterious call. I asked the investigator to check her background too," revealed Edward. "Patricia Anderson has impeccable credentials, international training, references from important families, almost too perfect." "Like Claire," completed Ruby, feeling a chill. The sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. Margaret entered the room with a worried expression. "Mr. Edward, the landline seems to be dead. I tried to call my daughter in Boston, and there's no dial tone." Edward immediately took out his cell phone, noting the absence of signal. "The cell signal is also down. It could be the storm, but—" He exchanged a significant look with Ruby. "I'll check with security," he decided, standing up. "Ruby, don't leave this room. Mrs. Margaret, stay with them." As soon as Edward left, Ruby felt a growing uneasiness. "Mrs. Margaret, have you noticed anything strange in Patricia's behavior today?" The housekeeper nervously adjusted the brooch she always wore on her dress collar. "To tell the truth, yes. After you went to the beach, I saw her making several calls in the garden, away from the house, and later, she was going through Mr. Edward's documents in the library." "And you didn't find that suspicious?" "I did, but—" Margaret hesitated. "Who am I to question a professional hired directly by Mr. Edward? In this house, I've learned to see without commenting." Ruby understood the housekeeper's dilemma. The rigid hierarchy of the Sullivan mansion had created a culture of silence that allowed suspicious situations to go unnoticed. "Where is Patricia now?" asked Ruby, determined to confront the situation. "The last time I saw her, she was going up to the 2nd floor. At that moment, the house's energy system completely failed, plunging the environment into total darkness." Michael began to cry again, frightened by the sudden change. "The emergency lights should have automatically activated," commented Margaret, her voice betraying concern. "The system is independent." Ruby felt her heart accelerate. This wasn't a coincidence. First the communications, now the energy. Someone was deliberately isolating the house. "Mrs. Margaret, take Michael," instructed Ruby, transferring the crying baby to the housekeeper's arms. "I'll look for Edward. Stay here, and don't open the door to anyone but me or him." "But Ruby, in the dark—" "I know this house well now," assured Ruby, although the truth was that she was following her instinct more than any familiarity with the environment. Using her cell phone flashlight, Ruby advanced through the corridor toward the exterior, where Edward had gone to check security. The storm battered the windows, and the sound of heavy rain almost muffled her steps. Upon reaching the back door, she found it ajar, allowing gusts of wind and water to enter. "Edward!" she called, her voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. There was no response. With growing apprehension, Ruby risked going out onto the covered porch, illuminating the path with the weak light of her cell phone. There, she found one of the security guards fallen on the ground, unconscious but breathing. Fear transformed into panic. Something was definitely wrong. Ruby ran back into the house, determined to return to Michael and Margaret. On the way, she heard voices coming from the second floor. Turning off her cell phone flashlight, she silently climbed the stairs, guided only by the occasional lightning that illuminated the interior of the house. In the upper corridor, she realized that the voices were coming from Michael's room. Approaching cautiously, she could distinguish Patricia's voice, surprisingly assertive, different from her usual professional tone. "Everything is ready. The house is isolated as you requested," a second female voice responded, with an unmistakable tone of authority. "Good. And Michael?" "Downstairs, with that housekeeper and the old housekeeper. Edward went to check security. Our men should have neutralized him by now." "Neutralized how?" The second voice showed concern. "I don't want unnecessary violence, Patricia. That would complicate everything." "Just sedated, as we agreed. Emma, we need to act quickly. The storm gives us cover, but it won't last all night." Ruby felt her blood freeze. Emma was there in the house and Patricia was her accomplice. The plan to take Michael from Edward hadn't been abandoned, just adapted. Gathering all her courage, Ruby silently returned to the lower floor. She needed to find Edward and protect Michael at all costs. On the way to the room where she had left Margaret, she heard a weak moan coming from a closet under the stairs. Opening it carefully, she found Edward sitting on the floor, semi-conscious, with a trickle of blood running from his temple. "Edward!" she urgently whispered, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" "Someone attacked me from behind," he murmured, trying to focus his gaze. "Ruby. Michael. He's with Mrs. Margaret, but we need to act quickly. Emma is here with Patricia. They plan to take Michael." The mention of Emma seemed to completely awaken Edward. With Ruby's help, he managed to stand up, although he was still visibly dizzy. "My cell phone," he searched his pockets. "I need to call for reinforcements. There's no signal, remember? They've completely isolated the house." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. "The boat," he finally said. "There's a boat anchored at the private pier. It has a maritime radio that can work even without cell signal." "First, we need to get to Michael," insisted Ruby. "Mrs. Margaret is alone with him in the living room." Supporting each other, Edward and Ruby silently advanced toward the main living room. As they approached, they heard Margaret's voice, strangely calm. "I don't believe this is necessary, Miss Emma. Mr. Edward is a good father." "A good father who barely knows his own son," replied a cutting female voice. "Michael deserves to be raised by his mother's family, not by an opportunist who only married Laura out of interest." Ruby and Edward stopped at the entrance to the room, hidden by the darkness. The scene, illuminated only by an emergency lantern, was surreal. Patricia was beside an elegant woman who could only be Emma, while Margaret, still holding protected Michael in her arms, maintained a surprisingly firm posture. "I believe you're making a mistake, Ms. Emma," continued the housekeeper with dignity. "What you're doing is illegal and will harm Michael, not help him." "Don't come to me with moral lessons, Margaret," Emma replied coldly. "You've worked for the Sullivans for decades and never questioned anything. Why start now?" "Because now it's not just about keeping my job, but protecting an innocent child," replied Margaret, her voice gaining strength. "A child who has finally found stability and love." Emma laughed without humor. "Love? From a housekeeper who takes advantage of the situation to get closer to the widowed boss? Please, Margaret, you've seen this movie before." It was at that moment that Ruby felt Edward's hand squeeze her arm, signaling it was time to intervene. Together, they entered the room. "Enough, Emma," Edward's voice echoed with authority, despite his debilitated state. "This ends now." Emma turned, momentarily surprised, before regaining her composure. "Edward, how nice that you decided to join us. I was explaining to your housekeeper that I've come to take my nephew, to give him the life he deserves." "Michael has the life he deserves here, with me," replied Edward, slowly advancing to the center of the room. "I'm his father, and you have no legal right over him." "Legal rights can be altered," replied Emma with a calculated smile, "especially when there's evidence of neglect, evidence that Claire collected for months, and that Patricia admirably complemented." Patricia maintained a neutral expression, although her eyes betrayed growing nervousness. "Mr. Edward, it's nothing personal. I was hired for a job. Betraying a family's trust and conspiring to kidnap a child is quite personal, Miss Anderson, intervened Ruby, stepping forward, and completely unforgivable. You're not in a position to judge anyone, replied Emma, evaluating Ruby with contempt. A simple housekeeper who meddled where she wasn't called. A woman who saved my son when your plans started to go wrong, corrected Edward. Ruby isn't just a housekeeper, Emma. She's part of this family now. Those words, spoken with such conviction, created a moment of silence laden with emotion. Ruby felt her heart expand with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that she didn't yet dare to name. How touching, Emma mocked, breaking the moment. But that changes nothing. We'll leave here with Michael and you can't stop us. My men are all over the property. Your men are being detained at this exact moment. A new voice emerged from the entrance to the room. It was Teresa Sullivan, accompanied by 2 police officers. As you will be, Emma. The surprise on Emma's face was almost comical. Teresa, you were supposed to be in Cambridge, and you should know that nobody manipulates a Sullivan. Teresa replied coldly. When you insisted so much that I returned to Cambridge because of that supposed urgent charity event, I realized something was wrong. Your men were careless. They left clues that my driver, Anthony, a former police officer, immediately recognized. The police officers advanced, one of them handcuffing Patricia while the other approached Emma. Emma Mary Claire Spencer, you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping, invasion of private property and conspiracy, the officer formally announced. This is absurd. I'm Michael's aunt. I have rights, protested Emma as she was handcuffed. Your only connection to Michael is being his mother's cousin, corrected Edward, and any rights you imagined you had were completely invalidated by your criminal actions. As the police officers led Emma and Patricia out, the storm began to subside, as if nature was responding to the resolution of the conflict. Slowly, the house lights began to flicker and return, the emergency generators finally working. Teresa approached her son, examining the wound on his temple with genuine concern. You need a doctor. I'm fine, Mother, assured Edward before turning to Margaret, who still protectively held Michael. And Michael? He's perfectly fine, replied the housekeeper with a tired smile. A brave baby, like his father. Michael, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded, extended his little arms toward Edward, who took him without the usual hesitation. The baby immediately snuggled, as if he knew he was finally safe. Ruby observed the scene, feeling a mixture of relief and emotion. Everything had ended well, but she knew that the revelations of that night would permanently change the dynamics of the Sullivan family. Ruby, called Teresa, surprising her, I owe you an apology. Ma'am, I judged you incorrectly based on my own prejudices and past experiences, admitted Teresa, with a dignity that Ruby hadn't witnessed before. Your love for Michael is genuine, and your loyalty to our family unwavering. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old lady. Ruby smiled, genuinely touched by the recognition. There's nothing to forgive, Mrs. Teresa. We all just want the best for Michael, and for Edward, added Teresa with a significant look that made Ruby blush slightly. In the following hours, the house was taken over by police officers and experts who collected evidence and took statements. The storm had completely passed, leaving the air clean and a starry sky visible through the large windows. On the porch overlooking the sea, Ruby found Edward sitting alone after Michael finally fell asleep and all the police procedures were concluded. May I join you? She asked softly. Edward nodded, indicating the seat beside him. For a few moments, both just contemplated the now serene ocean, reflecting the moon and stars like a perfect mirror. I'm still processing everything, Edward finally confessed. How was I so blind for so long? You were dealing with your own grief, replied Ruby gently, and Emma deliberately exploited that. Thanks to you, her plan failed. Edward turned to face her directly. You saved my son twice, Ruby. First that morning in the kitchen and again today. I only did what anyone would do. No, Edward shook his head. You did what only someone with an extraordinary heart would do. Someone capable of loving a child who isn't yours as if he were. Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. Michael is easy to love. Like his father? Asked Edward, his voice low and vulnerable. The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities. Ruby felt her heart accelerate, aware that they were on the edge of something profound and transformative. His father is learning to be lovable, she finally replied, with a soft smile. And that makes him even more admirable. Edward covered her hand with his, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. "Ruby, I don't know exactly what the future holds for us, but I know I want you to be part of it, not as an employee, but as a partner in raising Michael and perhaps with time as something more." "That would be very inappropriate, Mr. Sullivan," replied Ruby, with a touch of humor to mask the emotion. "Extremely inappropriate, Ms. Mitchell," he agreed, a rare smile illuminating his face. "But since when did we save babies in the kitchen sink? I believe we left conventions behind." Ruby laughed, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. "In that case, I'm willing to see where this journey takes us." Under the starry sky of Bayport, two people whom destiny had brought together in an unexpected way sealed their commitment with a simple but deeply meaningful embrace. Inside the house, Michael slept peacefully, finally free from the shadows of the past and surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally. The next morning, when the sun rose over the ocean, illuminating the house with a golden light, a new, unconventional family was having breakfast on the terrace. Edward held Michael in his lap, while trying awkwardly to feed him cereal. Ruby observed, patiently guiding, while Teresa and Margaret conversed amicably, sharing stories about Edward's early years. The pendant with the initials MCS, which had caused so much concern, was finally explained by Teresa during breakfast. It had belonged to Mary Catherine Sullivan, Edward's paternal grandmother, and had been placed in Michael's crib by herself, as a family tradition of protection. Claire, upon discovering the object, probably associated it with Emma, Mary Claire Spencer, and kept it as possible evidence of some mystical connection between aunt and nephew. "Some traditions deserve to be maintained," commented Teresa, looking significantly at Ruby, who was now helping Edward clean up the cereal that Michael had spread everywhere. "And others deserve to be reinvented," responded Edward, exchanging a complicit look with Ruby. 6 months later, the Sullivan mansion in Cambridge was the scene of a small but significant ceremony. In the garden, decorated with the orchids that Laura had loved so much, Edward and Ruby formalized their union in an intimate celebration, with Michael, now almost 15 months old, playing the role of an awkward ring-bearer, carrying the rings with the attentive help of Margaret. Teresa, surprising everyone, made an emotional toast. "To the family we build, not by blood but by love. To the memory of Laura, who left us Michael as her greatest gift. And to destiny, which brought us Ruby when we needed her most." That night, after all the guests had departed and Michael had finally fallen asleep, Edward found Ruby in the kitchen, the place where it all began, preparing tea. "You know what impresses me most," he commented, embracing her from behind. "How something so extraordinary can arise from such unlikely circumstances. Like a housekeeper who becomes a mother and wife," teased Ruby, turning to face him. "Like a broken man who learns to love again," corrected Edward, kissing her softly, thanks to a kitchen angel who had the courage to break the rules. Under the roof of the Sullivan mansion, now a true home, 3 lives previously separated by pain and circumstance found each other, forming bonds that no conspiracy or resentment could break. Bonds of a family built not by obligation or convention, but by choice and unconditional love.